Hi, everybody. Welcome to the public consultation for the methodology framework for carbon capture and storage. We're just a minute past the top of the hour, so I think we're going to get going, though I was watching the participant list still increasing. So I think some participants are still trickling in. We'll just get going, and hopefully those people will be able to kind of catch up. The presentation is being recorded, so if you miss anything, you should be able to capture it afterwards. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Julie Aguko, who will be starting off our presentation today. And I'll just note to all our presenters that when it's your first time to speak, that you should please just introduce yourself. So Julie, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, welcome to today's webinar to present for public consultation, the methodology framework for carbon capture and storage. As Ian mentioned, my name is Julie Aguko, Senior Program Officer here at Verra, Senior Program Officer for Energy Innovation. I have with me Ian Kuwahara, who you just met, Director of Energy and Industrial Innovation here at Verra, Matthias, Krey, and Engin, Mert from the CCS Plus Secretariat, which is the lead developer for this methodology. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on the Verra website. And similarly, it will be shared with you following this webinar. All participants have your mics muted, and we ask that you please use the Q&A function to communicate with the panelists at any time during the webinar. Please feel free to send in your questions, and we will try to address as many as possible within the hour scheduled for this webinar. And with that, Ian, Matthias, Engin, and I will walk you through the details of this public consultation and answer any questions, and answer as many questions best we can. Okay. So the webinar objective is to present an overview of the proposed methodology for carbon capture and storage developed under the VCS program. And as part of this webinar, the agenda will involve an overview of Verra as an organization and the VCS program, the methodology development and approval process, the presentation of the methodology itself, which will involve an introduction, an overview of the CCS Plus initiative, and the methodology details, which will include applicability conditions, additionality, quantification, and permanence details. This will then be closed off with a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. So to start us off, Verra, for those who are new, here is a nonprofit organization founded in 2007 with its headquarters in DC. However, we have staff across the world outside of the US in several other countries. Our main focus is development and management of standards for a sustainable future. You may have previously heard of us for our flagship program, the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, and most widely used global voluntary carbon market standard in the world. But since then, Verra has diversified to include additional standards, including the JNR, the Jurisdictional and Nested RED Plus standard, which aims to provide guidance and crediting for government-led RED Plus projects. We have the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity standards, which, while crediting GHG reductions, aims to enhance the livelihoods of local communities, smallholder farmers, and conservation of biodiversity. We have the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, SDVista for short, for certification of SDG benefits. And finally, we have the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard, which aims at issuing plastic credits for waste collection and recycling projects around the world. A little about the VCS standard, our most widely used voluntary GHG program, and the program under which the CCS methodology has been developed. Under the VCS, we have gained a lot of experience for project development with a global reach of over 1,800 projects currently registered. Under Verra, we have issued 1 billion carbon credits thus far. And under the VCS, we are able to convene a diverse group of stakeholders to work on development of workable frameworks that support innovation and allow finance to be directed to high impact project activities. And I would like to just point out for this webinar, the CCS methodology will really dive into the methodology development process, because CCS methodology has been developed under this program. So second in our agenda is the MDRP, our methodology development and approval process. This involves essentially 6 steps. The first step being the methodology idea note, the MIN. The MIN is a high-level summary of project activity action, the mitigation potential, the risks, and the sustainable developments that can be achieved by the proposed project. This is then submitted to Verra that has 3 potential outcomes, which is an approval, a reject, or an on hold. We have second to that the concept note stage, which outlines the proposed math elements, which is the baseline approach, the additionality assessment, quantification of GHGs, and how permanence is assured. Following the concept note stage, we go through a methodology development, which is done in accordance to all the VCS rules. And the methodology development within it requires the proponent to share with us a project description, a draft project description of how the approach would be applied to a project activity. Following the MET development, we have the public consultation, which the CCS methodology is currently undergoing. This involves a 30-day comment period whereby we reach out to stakeholders to seek input and feedback on the proposed methodology and the approaches in the documents that have been shared in our website. We then have a VVB assessment of the methodology and public consultation response, which involves integration of the feedback from the stakeholder consultation and a validation process by verified and validation bodies to ascertain that the methodology conforms to science and meets the criteria for climate action. Following the VVB assessment, we have the final Verra review of the updated methodology, including the integrated feedback and the final VVB assessment report. The Verra review leads to potential outcomes of an accept or reject. And if the methodology the updated methodology ticks all the boxes as per the VCS rules and requirements, the methodology is published and ready for use by potential project developers. The next item on our agenda is an introduction. Why we are developing a CCS methodology, why do a CCS methodology at all? And second, how it all works, how CCS actually works. So carbon capture and storage, CCS for short, is a key technology that can be applied to diverse and hard-to-abate sectors. Hard-to-abate sectors including steel, cement industry, the petrochemical industries, which are referred to hard-to-abate because typically they have limited or no abatement solutions. So we are looking to provide a solution with the CCS methodology. And the sectors similarly have significant growth potential and can be applied globally. So we are doing this to ensure that we develop a high impact methodology that will support the reduction and removal of emissions globally. We are aiming to ensure consistency across emissions and removal estimates. And we aim to integrate the current best practices and state-of-the-art technologies for carbon capture and storage. And as I mentioned as part of the agenda, just to give an overview of how it all works. CCS, carbon capture and storage, typically involves three major steps: the capture, the transport, and the storage. So the capture is where CO2 from the atmosphere or an industrial facility is separated, concentrated, and compressed using proven technologies such as DAPS. We have transport of the compressed CO2 using either pipelines or ships to a storage or an injection site. And we have the final storage step, which involves injecting CO2 into geological storage, underground rocks, or into materials or products like cement. And with that, I will hand over to Matthias to walk us through the CCS Plus initiative, who is the lead developer for this methodology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. And hello, everybody. Thank you for participating and for your interest in the methodology that we have developed and where we are now seeking your inputs as part of the Verra VCS public consultation period. And let me start off with explaining who is the CCS Plus initiative and what are we doing and how are we doing it. There is some information on this on the next slide, which shows our mission statement. And we are a global multi-stakeholder alliance. By the way, Julie, will you move the slides or do I have to do it? Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Julie. So we are a global multi-stakeholder alliance. We have a unique representation of solution providers, emitters, academia, as well as civil society among our partners. And our mission is to help scale CCS technologies, including CDR technologies, by building a high quality accounting framework for emission reductions and removal carbon credits to start off with. And we do have a quite unique approach in the sense that we are developing here an integrated carbon accounting methodology infrastructure. We are starting in collaboration with Verra and the VCS standard with the VCS methodology framework that is for public consultation now, but we also have an ambition to bridge the gap to the compliance markets, and what this means I will show on one of the later slides. We are developing the work, the methodologies under the CCS Plus initiative in one big tent, as we used to say. This means that it is a truly collaborative effort across industry experts, across researchers, and across academia, you know, to make it work and to have this according to the highest best practice possible. And we are doing this under public scrutiny. That is very important for us. At the end, it's going to become a public good that will be used for carbon crediting, but that could also be used for other purposes, you know, / bridging this gap to compliance markets. And that's why we are really looking forward to receive all of your feedback as part of the public consultation. Let's have a look at who is inside the CCS Plus initiative. And let's start here in the middle of the slide with our core partners. By the way, in total, you can see that we are here dealing with more than 50 organizations that are associated with the CCS Plus initiative. And our core partners that you can see here in the middle are also the ones that are on our steering committee. The steering committee sets the strategy for the CCS Plus initiative, the work plan and the budget. And all the core partners, of course, also actively contribute to the different work streams that we have in the CCS Plus initiative and are working together with us on the technical documents. And so do also our partners and technology partners. You can see all those names listed here. They are not on the steerco, but they also work very actively together with us at the CCS Plus initiative secretariat and the carbon consultants on the methodological document. So the first 4 form methodology documents that are now under public consultation have been really developed in a very collaborative and broad participation manner. When I say we and the work, then I'm talking about the carbon consultants. This is South Pole and this is Perspectives Climate Group. And by the way, I forgot to introduce myself properly. I'm recognizing now. My name is Matthias Krey. I'm part of the management of Perspectives Climate Group, and I'm the lead of the CCS Plus initiative. And we are leading the CCS Plus initiative jointly together with South Pole. And this means that we are taking care of all the administration and coordination within the CCS Plus initiative, and that the team of carbon consultants, our technical experts, works together with all of the partners on developing the methodological documents. And we also do have an advisory group that is very important for us, that provides an independent and critical view, constructive view into the work agenda, as well as the outputs that we are producing inside the CCS Plus initiative. And of course, there is Verra as and the VCS as the standard setting body that we are submitting the methodological documents to. And Julie has just shown the process that the methodologies and the outputs will have to go through before they can be finally adopted by the VCS as an approved methodology. What makes the CCS Plus initiative or our approach to developing the methodology special? Well, there are numerous features that later on Ian will present when he talks in more detail about the methodology, but there's one particular point that I would like to highlight here, and this comes back to our main objective of developing an integrated approach for carbon accounting, carbon crediting. And what we mean by that is that as we're dealing with a value chain beyond the capture, the transport, and the storage, with different players, different entities involved in this value chain, different kinds of capture technologies, different modes of transportation. We can talk about geological carbon sequestration. We can also talk about long-term use in products, for example. So this is to say that there can be different activities carried out along the value chain. And what we mean by integrated is that the methodological documents that we are putting out can be combined in a plug-and-play fashion to make sure that all the relevant greenhouse gas emission sources are covered under a carbon crediting project. How do we do that? We are developing a framework methodology. For example, the methodology that we've come out with for public consultation is the CCS Plus methodology. And under the CCS Plus methodology, or to be used with the CCS Plus methodology, we are developing different modules that represent different technologies along the value chain. So we have different methodological modules for capture, for transport, and for storage. And the modules that we have come out with now is the direct air capture module, is the all types of transportation modes module, and is the saline aquifer storage module. So if you as a project participant want to develop a project where the CCS Plus methodology is applicable to, then you take the methodology, you take the corresponding capture module, you take the corresponding transport module and the storage module, and then you use those methodological documents in order to fill the project documentation. In my last slide, I would like to mention how we are planning to bridge the gap between voluntary and compliance markets. And I would like to take a look at with you first to the left side of this slide. And there you can see in gray, you can see the project level methodology framework and modules that we are developing under the CCS Plus initiative. So it's a project level. That's what we're used to when we're doing carbon crediting. But we believe that beyond the project level, the methodologies that we are developing have a high value to be used at the regional, national, and supranational level. And what do we mean by that? We mean this in the sense of they can be, in our view, very good starting points for developing monitoring, reporting, and verification frameworks under different instruments. They can be Article 6, they can be cross-border accounting instruments, they can be tax rebate schemes. So all of those schemes that need an MRV framework can benefit from the methodologies that we are developing, so that financing and piloting and scaling can happen, which is needed in order to scale this market and those technologies. And how we are doing this, how we're concretely bridging the project and the different other levels up to the supranational level, is we are doing this through what we call compliance guidances. And we are going to come out, or we are very soon to come out with a compliance guidance on the EU and how our methodology can be used there, for example, in the context of the CRCF. And we will also soon release a compliance guidance on the Article 6, and we have started already a compliance guidance on US regulatory incentives. You can see here more compliance guidance that we are going to come out with as part of our work plan in the future. So I'm going to end my presentation and my intro into the CCS Plus initiative here. I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have on the initiative, as well as the methodologies that we've put out for public consultation. And I'll assume I'll hand back over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Matthias. So I'm Ian Kuwahara, Director of Industrial and Energy Innovations here at Verra, and have been working closely with Julie and Matthias on the development of the methodology. So I'll be talking about some of the little more nitty-gritty details related to the methodology elements and the module elements that are out for public consultation now, and also what we're considering releasing in the future in some of the future modules. But just quickly, the key elements of this methodology: applicability conditions, additionality, assessment approaches, and then the quantification details itself. So diving right into what is key about this methodology, I've got a few bullet points here that I think highlight some important points that aren't necessarily covered in the rest of the slide that I think are important for the audience here and stakeholders in general to understand. First and foremost, this is a modular framework. It allows different project configurations to apply components, or as Matthias described it, a plug and play documentation system to help simplify the quantification and make the number of pages that any one proponent has to read to understand what they have to do for the quantification lower and simpler. The other benefit described in the second bullet is that it's adaptable to future modules and tools being added. So as technologies evolve, or as things become maybe more common or less common, it allows us to make changes and evolve the framework without having to change all of the documents. Interestingly, as described in the third bullet, this is a new sectoral scope for the VCS. It's sectoral scope 16 for carbon capture and storage. You can find the sectoral scopes on the VCS website. An important point that we think merits early sort of identification and acknowledgement is the fact that this methodology differentiates removals and reductions. The VCS program did a public consultation on a removal label in mid-2022 and has published the responses to that public consultation, I believe, early in 2023. And so changes to the VCS program to allow for differentiation between removals and reductions at the credit level, so effectively a label for removals, are forthcoming. And this methodology is being designed to acknowledge and make use of that differentiation in the program. And so we can talk a little bit about that, or we're interested in getting feedback from stakeholders on that. Another point is that this methodology enables and encourages hubs. So we foresee CCS projects being built in a way that's fairly unique compared to other project types in the VCS. You could have a capture, transport, and storage facility that is operating as a VCS project, and then another capture facility being built on and sharing that transport system in the future, and that the original proponents may not know about all the expansion potential or expansion activities that could come on during the lifetime of their first CCS project. And so these expanding hubs could be a really important way for impact and climate action to scale at cost. And so we want to make sure that we're kind of getting ahead of that, enabling it and encouraging it. Finally, I think we've got some really important and stringent permanence requirements and closure requirements that help mitigate and minimize the risks for reversals, which is sort of the VCS or carbon way of talking about leaks from the reservoir itself. So those are the key points. Moving on to applicability, I'll just kind of overview the maybe highlights of applicability conditions that are listed in the methodology framework document, as well as in each of the transport, capture, transport, and storage modules. So this isn't all the applicability conditions across the 4 documents, but it's sort of maybe just an overview. First and foremost, it's globally applicable. So we're very interested in seeing action around the world. Project activities can include capture, must include capture and storage. Transport is actually optional, and the way transport would be optional is if you have your storage site co-located with your capture facility or adjacent, so the property boundaries are touching, then we wouldn't consider that to have any transport segments, and you wouldn't need to use the transport module. The eligible project activities for capture are what's being consulted on right now, which is direct air capture or capture from the atmosphere. And then future modules, we currently are intending to include BECCS or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, post-combustion capture, so from point sources like power plants, coal power plants, for example, industrial sources, so these could be petrochemical or chemical processes, hydrogen production for steam methane reforming, for example, and then lastly, from oil and gas, in particular, acid gas separation or native gas, native CO2 at gas plants. Of note, I guess, for today, oh, sorry, can you go back one slide, Julie? I'm not quite done going through applicability. Of note for today, the direct air module allows for co-capture, meaning if you have fossil fuel combustion on site at your direct air capture facility, you can capture that CO2 in addition to direct air capture from the atmosphere. The facilities can be new, expansion, or refurbishments. Transport includes pipeline, ships, rail, and road. Currently, we're only expecting to include those types of transportation, so no other transport modules are foreseen. And then for storage, the current module that's being consulted on is for storage in saline aquifers. Future modules would include depleted oil and gas reservoirs and mineralization. And this does not include utilization. Notably, utilization will still be developed under the CCS Plus banner, so through the organization or the initiative that Matthias described, but it'll actually be a separate methodology document. So quickly, just to highlight each of the questions that we are actually going for consultation on and that are included in the public consultation document. We have a question sort of related to the overall applicability and setup of the methodology, and that is whether proponents feel that it's appropriate that the reductions and removals be addressed under a single framework, or whether they should be separated. This inherently will sort of lead to complexities in the accounting, and that may or may not be seen as beneficial for our stakeholder base. So we're interested in understanding what the feedback is there. Moving on to additionality, we are interested in understanding stakeholder feedback related to the approach that we've taken and some other alternative approaches. We see that there's really sort of two key ones to assess additionality. The first one is the project method. And some of the bullets here on the slide overview what the project method is. Essentially, it's a project-specific assessment to determine whether or not this activity would have occurred without carbon credits. And there's elements like regulatory surplus, a barriers assessment, and then common practice. The barrier here has been proposed as an investment barrier. And we have selected the investment barrier to need to have an IRR less than 21%. And so that's something we're very interested in understanding, whether stakeholders believe that's reasonable, whether that's representative of the risk return profile for the sector, whether it's globally applicable in terms of like that being a representative IRR for all regions of the world. And guidance has also been provided in the methodology document about how to account for costs and revenues associated with the project. And in particular, when you have a collaborative hub approach and different actors are perhaps transacting CO2, so capture facilities may be selling or buying CO2 to the storage facility, or sorry, capture facilities may be selling and the storage facilities may be buying, or vice versa. And we've provided some guidance on how those various transactions should be accounted when you're looking at the IRR. The second approach, which is a little bit simpler, is a standardized approach, and I mean simpler from the project proponent's perspective. It's an evaluation at the sector level that's done during methodology development, and you create conditions and safeguards in the methodology that simplify the assessment for any one project's additionality, but it does make the sort of methodology development process quite a bit more complex. An approach that has been considered extensively within CCS Plus is the activity penetration approach. And there, the maximum adoption potential has to be determined. You use data that's available for either, globally in our case, or any of the jurisdictions where you're most particularly interested. And then the adoption must be determined to be less than 5%. And then that activity becomes sort of de facto at the methodology level additional. And so we think in many cases, in many regions, that CCS will be below the 5% threshold for activity penetration. We've struggled to get data, and we also think it's in some cases hard to determine the maximum adoption potential, in particular for DACs. And in addition to that, we think there are cases where, for example, in the US with the IRA funding, the financial viability of certain project types may be already sort of positive, and that may undermine the validity of doing a activity penetration approach for assessing additionality. So the questions that were included in the public consultation document are shown on the screen. We've got 5. I think I won't read out each of the questions, but make note of them, and I encourage participants here on the call today to ask questions during the question period, through the Q&A feature, or to submit feedback to the email addresses included in the public consultation document, because these are really important questions for us, and this is important stuff. So I'll just forge ahead without actually reading any of these questions. Next section is about the quantification itself. So the overall highline quantification approach is similar as it would be to other methodologies, so baseline minus project and leakage emissions. The baseline in this case is CO2 injected at the storage site, so you actually measure the baseline volume at the storage site during the project. You would deduct any non-VCS CO2 that will be a module or a tool that's released later in the development of the methodology framework, so we're not consulting on non-VCS CO2 right now. Project emissions would include all the fossil fuel electricity consumption at capture, transport, and storage sites. And we have considerations in each of those documents for third-party cogeneration energy supplies, so that includes off-site generation. It also would allow for waste heat utilization. So in many cases, there could be waste heat that is valuable and useful for things like reboiling capture fluids or regenerating capture fluids. And so we allow for that. The use of biogenic fuels is also something where consideration has been given. And then we have simplified but conservative estimation approaches for short segments of transport, and that's included in the transport module. Leakage in this case is meant to describe sort of from the carbon accounting vernacular perspective, emissions that are occurring outside of the project boundary. So we are respecting the sort of lingo of the carbon world and maintaining that use of the word leakage here. We'll talk about leaks from the reservoir in the next slide, but leakage here includes upstream fuel and electricity emissions. It could include fabrication of capture material, so embodied carbon in the fluids or capture media, which can be significant for direct air capture facilities. And it may also include construction emissions, which notably the VCS program is consulting on in parallel. So I'd encourage participants to go check out the program consultation on construction emissions as it relates to particularly to DACs. So moving along, we now can talk about the reservoir monitoring and permanence requirements. So monitoring in the methodology document is divided into intentional and unintentional discharges. This is actually described in the storage module. Intentional includes venting and blowdowns for safety and maintenance, and it can be measured because it's an intentional event that the proponent would know about before it's happening, but also allows for conservative estimates. For unintentional, it's divided into the surface and subsurface. So surface unintentional would include things like fugitive emissions, in particular behind the meter. So fugitive emissions before the meter aren't included in the baseline calculation and thus aren't relevant for deducting in the project emissions. And then similarly, equipment failures or line breaks or ruptures in pipelines and things like that. So that's all sort of considered surface. And the subsurface, these would be what I think most people think about when they think of the risk of non-permanence when it comes to CCS, and that's reservoir losses. And so there's a monitoring plan requirement in the GCS requirements document, which is a program document. And the methodology has furthered that requirement by defining the need for a detection threshold for each of the monitoring techniques and a monitoring frequency. And the proponent is then to deduct the minimum detection threshold and monitoring frequency, the resulting sort of volume that could be leaking out of the reservoir in each monitoring period as sort of a conservative default. And then of course, if any reversals are occurred, those must be deducted from any assertions that are made in that crediting period as well. Next slide. So here again are the questions that I've kind of surfaced from the public consultation document. There's 3 for the general quantification and then 1 on the permanence. And I won't read them as I did the last time, and I think proponents can feel encouraged to either ask questions about this feedback here or supply the comments to the email. With that, I'll turn it back to Julie, who can talk about our next steps.
Ian. Um, just to close off the presentation part of the webinar, following the public consultation, we have, like I mentioned, we have a 30-day stakeholder feedback period. So you are encouraged as much as possible to send in your comments, to send in your feedback, especially directed towards the questions we have included as part of the public consultation. All this, as mentioned, are found on our website, and you can fill in the public consultation template form and send it to Verra at any given time within the 30-day period. So following the public consultation, we will have a period from August to September of this year, where the modules are going to be revised as per the input from the stakeholder consultation. And this is going to involve integration, review, and consolidation of all the comments, all the feedback that you will send our way. And we will consolidate this and share with the developer the CCS Plus initiative to encourage them to integrate into the draft methodology that is open for public consultation. Following this is the module validation, which will be part of the VVB assessment that I mentioned as part of the NDRP. So the VVB will review the methodology. They will look at the integration of the feedback into the draft methodology and prepare an assessment report that is then sent to Verra. In Q4 of this year, the methodology revision will be concluded. And then this is by the developer that will be then submitted to Verra for final review and an outcome, a decision whether we are publishing this methodology for its under the VCS. So this will be finalized in 2024, and the revised methodology will be ready for use by potential project developers looking to develop projects under any of the modules that we have put up for use. So just to close this part off, all this information, including the public consultation documents, there is a public consultation framework that we have included that you can use as a guide for the stakeholder feedback. All are available on our website. And as I mentioned, this presentation will be shared following this webinar. And you can, again, go through this. You can go through the slides, you can go to our website and just read through the documents and send in your feedback. Just to reiterate that the public comment period is open. Currently, it started on 30th of June when it was officially published for consultation. And this will be ongoing until the 29th of July this year. All comments will be submitted to the email address that is on this slide, the methodologies email address at verra.org. And then following that, just to reiterate this, Ian can close off this point of the presentation just to add that we do have other ongoing work that are very relevant to the methodology development for CCS. And Ian, close off this point.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Julie. Just quickly, there are other documents that kind of sit within the ecosystem of the CCS framework, and they are program documents, so not necessarily methodology documents or methodology elements. And those links are shared there. So it's the GCS requirements document and the non-permanence risk tool. Those were released earlier this year. And there are program consultations that are ongoing, and those are for program changes. And as I mentioned, one is related to the embodied carbon for construction emissions, and this is particularly important for DAX projects, which is the topic of the methodology consultation today. And we do have potential changes being consulted on for activity penetration as well. So I encourage participants to go look at that draft consultation. There is the potential for future updates related to this work. So we may digitize the MPRT, which is part of the digitization program here at Verra. And then we're also looking at an electricity tool within the VCS and that would make more consistent measuring electricity consumption across all project types and may provide guidelines for purpose-built green PPAs. So I think with that, we can finish off the formal part of the presentation and move to question and answers. So I'll be starting off. I think I'll just kind of go through the list and pick off ones that either I or other participants can answer. And just for everyone's knowledge, please, if you have any burning questions, type them into the Q&A, and we'll be going through that list and answering them here either live or by typing answers. So the first one I'll talk about is, could you please give an example of a CCS project briefly? So this one, I think maybe is covered in the slide that Julie presented, which showed an image of a capture plant and a pipeline, and then a really deep well delivering CO2 underground into a reservoir. But maybe to expound on that example a little bit, it could be that there is a natural gas power plant that is burning natural gas and emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. A capture facility would be installed on the flue gas of that, where the CO2 is captured out of the exhaust and compressed and transported to a reservoir and injected into the reservoir for long-term storage. So that would be an example there. Maybe just jumping to one, what's the difference between the methodologies versus the ISO standards? This one's interesting. So there are ISO standards. I don't remember the exact number. I think it's 2794, something like that, 27,094. So ISO 27094, something like that. Probably getting it wrong. One of my colleagues can feel free to either correct me live or in the chat, but those, I've seen those and you know, read through them extensively. I see those as a standard for the design and operation of good CCS projects. And that's great. That's an important element in the kind of community of like the body of knowledge that exists in the world related to CCS. What we're producing here today is what Verra thinks, and the CCS Plus initiative, so together, what we think are the right set of rules and requirements for a good CCS project to generate credits under the VCS. And so, you know, in many ways, having a good CCS project would be very similar to what ISO has described. But then on top of that, we have some rules and requirements that we need to sort of adhere to for our program integrity for issuing carbon credits. And so there is a little bit of a difference, but maybe the underpinnings or the fundamentals could be similar. I see a question on CCS at coal plants was mentioned, as well as AGD. AGD could be acid gas destruction. Not sure if anyone knows what AGD is. I'm going to assume it's acid gas destruction. So this methodology intends to credit CCS at coal plants. I would say the methodology framework has the intention of allowing for credits from coal plants, and that would be the post-combustion capture module, which isn't part of this consultation, but is forthcoming, so yes. Secondly, isn't AGD business as usual in most oil and gas jurisdictions? So acid gas destruction is definitely business as usual. Acid gas capture is different than acid gas destruction. So I'm not sure if I'm getting the acronyms right there. But I would even consider that, you know, acid gas capture and storage is, you know, kind of common, but it certainly represents an increased cost to most oil and gas operators compared to acid gas destruction. So I'm not sure that we can sort of put out the blanket statement that acid gas type facilities would be not additional, but it's certainly a risk that I think we'd be interested in exploring and making sure we have the proper safeguards in place when we're writing that module. And again, we aren't consulting on the actual acid gas capture module today. Okay, next question. How was the 21% IRR cutoff determined? Great question. So there was no science or theory behind it. I think we, as a collaborative initiative, looked at what various project financing requirements have been, and considered, you know, sort of the range of risk-reward profiles from sort of venture capital to very sort of blue chip infrastructure type projects that you might see at many of the companies that are going to be doing CCS projects, and sort of negotiated or just, you know, worked through a number that seemed palatable for everybody, or like least unpalatable for everybody. And because of that process, we're, I think, very interested in getting broader feedback. First of all, if there is kind of a scientific or theoretical way to determine the right IRR, we'd be happy to hear about it. And if not, then we'd be interested in understanding sort of what the balance of the stakeholder opinions are, so that we can make sure we're getting that number right. Okay, there's been a few questions that I think are more relevant for my colleagues at Perspectives to answer. So Matthias, maybe I'll turn it over to you if you have any questions that you want to answer.
Yes, Ian, thank you. And I do have a couple. I made some notes. Just stop me when you think I've covered enough terrain here. Let me first pick the question on the connection with the carbon removal certification framework between the standard and the carbon removal certification framework that is sort of being built by the EU. Well, that question speaks to the compliance guidance that I have mentioned during the presentation on my slides. In the compliance guidance on the EU, which and just to note, that's an output by the CCS Plus initiative, not by Verra. So it's a little bit of a different nature of a document, in the sense that it doesn't go through the Verra process, but is a separate output by the CCS Plus initiative, this compliance guidance and others. And there we are reflecting on, let's say, the usefulness, and if so, you know, how the methodologies can be used in the context of the carbon removal certification framework in the future. And we are going to come out with this in the next couple of weeks. And I think it will be a very interesting read. Then we had a question on how would BECCS be different from CCS, saying that BECCS would be -1 and that CCS would be 0. I think I understand this question in the sense that indeed it is different, because BECCS as a project type that is capturing atmospheric CO2, that's the condition, from sustainable biomass, and when the CO2 is stored permanently, then the outcome is a removal. Whereas when you have a classical CCS project, and the one that, for example, Ian has described earlier, where you're capturing the CO2 at a point source, such as a power plant from the flue gas, and then you permanently store it, then the outcome is an emission reduction. And I think the author of this question exactly meant that when he said -1, then in my words, a removal, and 0 in my words, an emission reduction. We had the question, how will individual projects allocate shared emissions in a hub? That is a great question, and that is something that that was very important for us to work on, and to work on in the sense of finding a solution, because we will have shared infrastructure On the transportation side and pipelines, for example, we will have shared infrastructure on the storage side. So in the next documents that we will send for public review, we will include a tool for differentiation between carbon crediting and non-carbon crediting CO2. There we will apply the approach of a mass balance across the value chain. And this means that there needs to be collaboration across the value chain of the different entities. And that brings me to the other question, which is, with the modular approach, what is a discrete VCS project and how is this handled? So a discrete VCS CCS project would always involve an entity that is carrying out the capture, an entity that is carrying out the transportation, and an entity that is carrying out the storage. They might be one and the same entities, but in a lot of cases they might not be, but only one can be project proponent, but they will have to do this together. And this is what, Ian, if you want to say a few words on this, I think that might be useful as well. You know, how this doing it together can look like.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it is a departure from probably the mindset of like the project boundary and the proponent in other project examples within the VCS, because I think these projects will naturally become large hubs. Like, you know, Northern Lights is an example, and there's many other hubs that have been proposed around the world. So these will be large, sort of sprawling infrastructure projects. And as per our program rules, a project boundary will be defined, and the stakeholders who are legally responsible and in control of the capture, transport, and storage systems are the proponents. So it could become a very large group of people or companies and just be a very large project. So that's the first thing. You know, it is just maybe very large and you know, much larger than many of the other project types within the VCS, both in terms of the physical scale or the dollars involved. Second, we are allowing for project expansion. And this is something that's included in the GCS requirements document and is specific right now just to like CCS projects. So a project can have capture, transport, storage, and after 5 or 10 years, a new capture plant can be added onto that. And it's essentially adding more sort of capacity, if you will, to the original project. There may be new proponents, it may be a different capture facility. And so we've put forward rules for how we would accommodate project expansion. And this is to facilitate, encourage expanding hubs, which we think is an important kind of strategic component of encouraging CCS and encouraging the climate action that comes with it. So yeah, I think that's maybe what I'll say there. Back to you, Matthias.
Thank you, Ian. Then we had several questions on utilization, so CCU. And indeed, in public consultation, we are now with the CCS plus methodology. And we have already started a concept note for CCU plus, for a CCU plus methodology. And the U there stands for long-term utilization. So we have 3 modules that we want to develop under this CCU plus methodology framework. For example, mineralization and construction materials. We have already Verra's approval for the concept note, and we are now developing starting to develop the methodology and the modules. And we also have the plan to work on short-term CCU, but there is no concept note there yet. So this work is not has not accelerated as to the same level as the long-term use of the CO2. The timeline for both, in the sense that you can see documents and public consultation, will be next year, I would expect.
Great. Maybe I'll just jump in and mention that we're at time. So I think participants can feel free to jump off, but I can stay and answer a few more questions, just because we have quite a long list of questions. There's a lot of great engagement here. So happy to do our best to try and get through a few more of the questions. But if participants want to jump off, they can feel free to do so without any guilt. And similarly to my other panelists, if you have other meetings or engagements that you have to jump off to, now would be appropriate time. So I'll maybe take it back, Matthias, and answer a few more questions from my side. So one was, how was the market adoption limit of 5% determined? So that was mentioned on the slide about additionality, and in particular, the activity penetration. So the 5% threshold was actually taken from the VCS methodology requirements. So it's a program document that's been defined at the program level for many years. Not sure how it was originally determined, but I do think it is also a part of the common practice or activity penetration assessments in CDM documents. So I think there's some commonality there between the VCS and the CDM, but it's a program document. So it wasn't determined in the sort of last few months as part of the CCS Plus initiative's methodology development. Have you specified unintentional from subsurface during the project, sort of during operation and post-closure? So this is a question, I think, focusing on the quantification of reversals, so the quantification of leaks, some from the reservoir. We have not differentiated unintentional from the subsurface during operation and during post-closure, but we do require reporting post-injection, and these requirements are included in the GCS requirements document. So that's not part of the consultation today, but it is an element of the ecosystem of requirements that are being imposed on these projects. And so if it's the first time that our stakeholders are encountering it, we would welcome feedback or questions about it so we can make it clearer. So we do require, so just to be clear about what I said, we do require monitoring reports both during operation, so during the actual crediting period, post-injection, which is the period after injection is stopped, but the site has yet to have been closed. I believe it's been a few months now since I've looked at the requirements. The monitoring reporting ends at closure. There are some requirements for post-closure monitoring, but the reporting does not have to go past that. So there's a distinction between sort of injection, post-injection, but pre-closure. And there are requirements in that period. And I believe our minimum, sort of the minimum duration of monitoring post-injection, regardless of when closure is 10 years. Jurisdictions may allow closure before 10 years, and we're flexible to that, but we would still then require post-injection monitoring for that minimum amount of time. So there's some like key and very explicit dates that should be reviewed and understood. So like the injection, closure, and then the monitoring period. They can differ depending on what jurisdictions either allow or require. And I want people to understand that, and happy to either receive comments or take questions on that as well. Let's see, kind of scrolling down, looks like there's still a lot of questions. Is there already any forecast for developing the module for CO2 capture from biogenic sources? So that's the BECS module that I referenced. That is in batch 2 of work package 1A. And so I think that's probably next in terms of sort of the modules to be released and for us to go to public consultation with. And I saw Matthias nodding, and so that's our plan right now. Let's see, so for monitoring, what can be the thresholds and triggers for reporting and responding to any anomalies or deviations from the expected CO2 behavior or performance? So I assume this is about downhole CO2 behavior performance, so reservoir. As I mentioned during the slides, we are creating the requirements for proponents to set up their monitoring program and all the different monitoring techniques, and then to identify the minimum detection threshold and the monitoring frequency for each technique. They have to then deduct the sort of maximum undetectable leak from their project in each reporting period based on that minimum detection threshold and the reporting or the detection frequency. And so that's kind of an inherent incentive to keep your minimum detection thresholds as low as possible and to increase your detection frequencies as high as possible, because you're basically paying for the maximum undetectable leak for the duration of that crediting period. And we think that's unique and powerful, maybe even, you know, we think it's a good way for kind of finding or striking that balance between how to encourage best performance, but without being too prescriptive in our requirements. We hope others see it that way, but we're open to feedback. So we don't set a threshold for what the reporting, you know, threshold needs to be, or what detection threshold there needs to be for any anomalies. We just sort of set up this incentive structure and then let the participants make their decisions as they will. Okay, specific question about DACs, which is great because that's what we're sort of here consulting about. Would the framework cover both solid sorbent and liquid high temperature DAC? So I think yes. I would look to Matthias if he has any other insight on what we're covering here, but I believe both, we had mentioned in the applicability conditions that the capture process could include media, so to me it's sort of like solid, or fluids, and that there has to be regeneration. So you can't be doing things like in-vessel carbon mineralization or enhanced weathering or these types of things. Like that isn't DAC. I think the key criteria that we defined for being a DAC plant is that you're reusing some media or some sorbent or fluid, and that there's a regeneration, and that the regeneration process results in concentrated sort of gaseous or fluidized high concentration CO2 that you then are transporting in pipes and injecting underground. So hopefully that answers that question. Maybe Matthias, if you have any other questions, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ian. I noted a couple. One was a question on short-term CCU and what kind of activities we would be covering there, and in terms of modules. And I can say that we haven't made the final selection yet. That is something that the steering committee of the CCS Plus initiative will decide. But the candidates we are looking at include, for example, plastics as well as fuels. Then there was a question on why we started with only one capture module in the public consultation process now and not more, and what would be the others. Well, the reason was that it was important for us to get the methodology out, plus one capture module, plus the transport module, plus the storage module, so that we cover the full value chain. So that's why we've gone out with one capture module at this stage. And as Ian said, we are going to soon have the BECS module on the capture side, but we are also looking at industrial emissions that would cover acid gas, for example, as well as capture of emissions from power and heat point sources. Then there was a question on if our work also applies for cross-border CCS. And yes, it applies in the sense of the project value chain that we just discussed and the different parts of the value chain, and that they need to work together in order to make one discrete VCS project. Now, it can so happen that this means that the CO2 is transported across a border and then stored in another country. And that is something that we are going to, from a carbon crediting point of view, it works. From VCS Verra point of view, it works. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ian. But there are, of course, implications to the national reporting of those countries. And that's what we are going to address in an upcoming compliance guidance that we want to work on, with which you look systematically at how does then the project level correspond to the national level, and how the quantification done on the project level can be used to inform the greenhouse gas inventory and its reporting, as well as the NDC, really on the national level.
Great, thanks, Matthias. Just a couple of more questions, and I think we'll end it. But there's a few good ones here that I think I can take. So, in a CCS regulated market like the UK, where the policymakers cover all costs and recognize a margin to the implementer, is the credit generation allowed? Did Verra already consider these cases? So I think what this person is talking about is contracts for difference. So we have considered contracts for difference, and they are potentially viable within the additionality assessment framework that we've proposed. There is some guidance that's included in the additionality section of the methodology document. If I try and cite it right now, I might get it wrong. So I encourage the stakeholders who are interested in this to look at the guidance for how we've treated contracts for difference. Essentially, I think what we've done is we've laid out some conditions that will either sort of validate or invalidate a project that's using contracts for difference as part of their project financing. So basically, some contracts for difference would be allowed to be used, and those projects would get credits in the VCS, but some wouldn't. And I think it depends on the conditions of the contract for difference. And so I think if you're someone who's considering developing a CCS project and you're going to get a contract for difference, it would be important for you to look at the requirements that we've proposed and either consider them in your contract development or consider providing us feedback, or both. Next question. I had another one, and okay. So AGD is acid gas disposal. I should have thought of that. Apologies. Thank you for the clarification. I think my answer still applies. Are EOR projects eligible? So EOR is not part of the consultation document that we're considering right now. So it's just DACs, and it's just storage and saline aquifers. So if you're doing EOR, that wouldn't be part of this public consultation. EOR is part of the CCS Plus work plan. We do see some complexity on the horizon with the ICVCM's core carbon principles, and I think I had seen a question higher up about ICVCM. So Verra is sort of very much going to be responsive to ICVCM's core carbon principles, and is already very much engaged in the process of helping create the guidance and provide feedback on the guidance and the core carbon principles. And EOR could conflict with some of the core carbon principles, in particular the one about being aligned with a net zero future. So that's something that we're concerned about and watching and thinking about as we go about reviewing the methodologies that are being developed by the CCS Plus initiative. And I think we're working hand in hand as well with CCS Plus as we sort of talk about and decide which components of which modules to be developing and what the eligibility criteria would be. Okay, maybe two more questions. Hopefully they're kind of quick. Will fugitive wellhead emissions at the site of sequestration be accounted for in leakage? What approach will be adopted to calculate this leakage? So as I kind of alluded to during my presentation, leakage in the kind of carbon parlance refers to emissions outside the boundary. Because fugitive emissions at the wellhead would be within the project boundary, we would just call those project emissions, and they are accounted as project emissions. I think the approach that's been taken is very similar to what's done in the US for the estimating fugitive emissions under the GHG RP, so Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. There's a CFR code that might be referenced in our methodology document as well, but it's, I think, an estimation technique that's based on what's done in the US, essentially, is the answer there. Leakage, so leaks from the reservoir are estimated in, there isn't really guidance from the EPA or anyone there, so that would be separate. Last question, has Verra a clear technical definition of removals and reductions? Where can it be found? So we don't yet. We consulted on definitions last summer, as I mentioned, and I believe you can still find the public consultation document on our website if you go to the section that gives past consultations. And there, a proposed definition for removals and reductions is available. And then I believe responses to comments received is also in that same area on the website. And so you can see anyone's comments and what they had said. So I encourage you to look there. Final removal and reduction definitions would be released with the program updates, which I believe will be happening in later this quarter. So we're 17 minutes overdue. We got through probably 60 or 70% of the questions. I think we'll cut it off there. We see people slowly trickling off. I appreciate the time and the effort that our stakeholders would be giving us to review these documents and provide feedback. Please, as Julie noted, provide feedback to the email address by the end of the comment period, which I think was July 29th. Thank you for the time. And with that, we'll close the webinar.